Our talk tonight of ships and women, stories from the crew agreements set up a Julia Cracker. After 1850, every British ship carried a crew agreement and official log for every voyage and took. In addition, unprecedented information on the lives of the average laboring people. They preserve the wild, weird, tragic, and the beautiful moments of everyday life at sea, at a time of wonder and change. This talk will describe the context of his archive and its place in Newfoundland and the Empire, and share some of those stories from the remarkable to the ridiculous. But please be advised that this lecture contains some stories of violence, adult themes, and language and sensitive topics. Dr. Stryker was born, she's a good Texan. She has a BA from St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, then made Memorial, where she first got interested in crew agreements. She has a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, a thesis from the But then you'll say she was used to the sea, Britain's 19th century empire and women's work at sea, and was completed under Philippa Levine, covered both practical realities of women's work at sea and how they were viewed culturally, particularly as a genre of the nautical novel developed over the century. It's presently the UA Pratt postdoctoral research in maritime, naval, and Newfoundland Labrador history at that time. Dr. Stryker.
So first, I want to make sure that I'm all properly hooked up. All right. And second, I want to say thank you. Thank you so much to the Historical Society for inviting me. I'm so excited to be here. I've been to some of the other lectures. It's just such a wonderful thing that you do. And I appreciate the lecture series very much. And that was a lovely introduction. Thank you. So tonight is going to be a night of stories. Hopefully new, but I'm gonna start with one that will probably be familiar to the home audience. And I don't actually know how, am I just signaling? Okay. Yeah.
It's coming up your face.
Well, I think I'm gonna have to be over here if I need to change a slide. Oh, yeah. I don't know, we'll find out. Oh yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yeah. Ha! We did it. Yes. Okay. Now we're going to start for real this time. All right. Let me see. Is this going to progress? Yay. Okay. It's a very British looking person, isn't it? That's Sir James Grigg. So this story should be pretty familiar probably to our home audience, but I wanted to go over it very briefly because I know there's some people that might not know. But in the 1950s, the government of Great Britain faced a crisis of space across a number of dimensions, not least of which is that quite naturally during the Second World War, paperwork had not only multiplied, but also been allowed to accrue. Since 1838, Britain had a policy of retention and preservation of public documents. This is a somewhat nebulous term. These were primarily legal records, which, as Paul Rock notes, quoting contemporary sources, were dispersed throughout some 60 metropolitan repositories staffed by what were called a multitude of imperfectly responsible keepers, administered by a bewildering variety of agencies, housed in very improper situations in unsuitable buildings, without proper management of their care and preservation, and subject to no superintendence or direction. 1838. So the 1838 Public Records Office Act created the Public Records Office, or the PRO, and it took a few decades to hash out what exactly they were doing and how they were going to do it. But the idea was that government papers needed to be centralized, organized, cared for, and accessible to the public as a fundamental and necessary part of an active, organized democracy. The 1830s, of course, being the reform period, right? So all of this is coming together. The records, however, proliferated faster than the space to hold them, and the abilities of even the professional corps of record minders to sort, particularly as technologies like typing, printing, replicating, communicating all proliferated as well. The systems developed in the 19th century were entirely unable to keep up in the 20th, so Parliament called for a committee headed by Sir James Grigg to review the policies regarding public records. In 1954, the Grigg Report set out recommendations that were put into effect in the Public Records Act of 1958. And with some modification, the Grigg system remained more or less the principle of the Public Records Office, now the National Archives, until primarily digital or digital-only records have complicated things once again. What are they doing now? I'm not 100% certain. It's probably a little Grigg-based still, but don't let me put words in their mouth. So, the Grigg system shifted the principle driving the archive from retention to weeding and selective destruction. Among the documents most in need of weeding were what were called in the report the particular instance papers. Those were of not much use to departments themselves after the short period of use or relevance to departmental business. They were typically papers relating to individuals or events, not policy or department level decision making, and were the vast majority of any department's production. Eliminating them as an entire category would save both immense space and the evaluative time it would take for sorting records. You wouldn't have the backlogs because they would all just go straight into an incinerator. Therefore, the crew agreements and logbooks that had been accumulating since roughly the 1850s, or more realistically the 1860s, on a voyage-by-voyage basis, could be destroyed. This immense collection of records was already housed off-site due to its bulk. When word leaked of its imminent destruction, however, the immediate protest was raised. Scholars, archives, and enthusiasts organized, and a very much unexpected hero, Memorial University of Newfoundland, stepped in at the last minute to keep the vast majority of the documents from the fire. But what does this actually mean, right? That's the familiar framework of the story. That's what got us the papers here. There's all kinds of complications and issues going on within that story. We add it on and add different flavors to it. But what does that mean? What was saved with this archive? What's actually in the documents? It was precisely the argument at the time that there certainly might be use and historical interest in them, but not enough to justify their upkeep. They're bulky, hard to access, of wildly varying character and content. It's not that nothing could be made of them, it's that Britain, much to the dismay of its enthusiasts, archivists, and historians, wasn't going to bother. There's since been a lot of work done and many uses made of them, and I could do and have done whole talks about that and the whole talk about them and how it's progressed and all that stuff. But what I would like to do tonight, basically, is just show you. Just gonna show you what we've got, and we're gonna go from there, and it's all the fun stuff. Some of the fun stuff is very inappropriate for the youths, but let's take a look. All right. Oop. Okay. What are we talking about when we talk about the crew agreements and logbooks? Broadly speaking, we're talking about this, a detailed contract, and if it exists, a variably detailed set of descriptions of particular kinds of events. Maybe you can tell just by looking, but the real meat is the contract. These are hugely dense documents that tell or at least suggest a whole lot about a whole lot of different aspects of trade, voyages, people, policies, all this stuff, all kinds of things. These tend to be a little bit harder to dissect, but they've got the goods, so to speak. And while, yeah, they're complicated and there's a lot of depth to them, I'll bet you've already noticed one level of detail that tells you a lot about what's going on in the documents, actually. And that is, it's red, right? It's printed in red. You can't actually tell because this screen is very washed out. So I didn't give you a chance to answer because it's hard to tell. But I bet you would have seen it. You would have noticed. It would have been the first thing you noticed. You got it. So these agreements were a living document for the duration of the voyage, being added to, amended, signed, stamped, passed around in all kinds of ways. So before a ship sailed at the start of a voyage, they would submit an office copy. And that actually, yeah, you can see it. Just tiny little office copy way up there at the top. You don't have to know it's red. And just from this, you know something about the voyage, which is that for some reason, the black printed copy never made it back to the office. And of course, the thing that leaps to mind is it was wrecked, it was destroyed, it went down with the ship. So already dramatically, these documents are densely layered, but you can pick up a lot of information just from some very observable on top of things, facts about them. Likewise, this is a green copy, slightly less exciting, or at least less dramatic. It's home trade voyages or short voyages going from port to port. But the richness really starts there. Let's bring up yeah. That one is one of the black printed copies. So you can see definitely a few differences. That is definitely black ink. Let's just be sure about that. Those ones are the vast majority of the documents that we have. As for the logs, the second picture here, that's a little trickier. For a lot of not always great or particularly consistent reasons, not all of the logs were retained, meaning there are stretches of time in which there are lots of logs, stretches of time in which there are practically none. And then you have the nature of the log itself. It's not a ship's log, meaning it's not recording the day-to-day activities of the vessel, the weather, that kind of stuff. It's just recording the things that Parliament requires them to record. But this too is an inconsistent description, particularly for earlier logs. Some of the ones I found in the NMM was just this book, and then you flipped it open and it said nothing to report. That was the whole book. Yep, that was apparently enough. So the specific requirements of this paperwork are in many ways new and very much in development over the decades, meaning there's lots of learning on their feet going on. This is why you get some logs like this, some logs like that. There's really no telling. Not every master or officer was also a master of the bureaucratic aspects of their job. So you get a lot of variance in what and how things are recorded, and as we will see, most particularly the how. Hopefully you all recognize from the poster the artistic stylings of one Master Robert Hogg. This is the one we used on the poster. There we go, and we can see more of it. He actually littered illustrations all the way through. Some of them are more interesting than others. The text in the smoke more or less says, God send grub, the devil sends cooks. So yeah. You can see some more of his little sketches at the tops of these. So I figure this is a good enough place to start for both matters of interest and also because this particular log was retained by the National Archives as part of their collection of materials related to celebrated ships. When getting ready to toss a lot of these documents into a fire, quite literally, they knew enough to know that some of these ships would be of perennial interest. And so they plucked out a list of the ones they thought were the ones that everybody was going to be interested in. Because one of the people doing that like tea clippers, all the tea clippers are in there. So it's an interesting list. This one made it. And it is not, in fact, because Hogg's drawings are quite fascinating, but it's that Joseph Conrad sailed on it. So other than the fact that he's there, though, there's not much to actually say about him from these records. Everyone else is another story. So one of the key purposes of these documents was to form a kind of legal record, meaning it was particularly important to record things like being disrated, which resulted in changes in wage rates and punishments, death and violence in general. This makes it hard to generalize about violence aboard ship on the broadest level because the logs are already preoccupied with taking note of those. Certain kinds of violence are just going to be in there. So that said, they were having a hell of a time on this ship, and the prevalence and severity of the violence aboard was highly variable. In one entry, I believe that's this one, some of them you'll be able to see a little bit more closely, but some of them, I think even if I blew this one up, it wouldn't make any difference. I don't think it'd be any more legible. But Samuel Wigg is accused of being very careless at the helm. And this is all given from the perspective of the person writing it, which is presumably Master Hogg or one of the mates, one of the other officers. When I was down at tea, he was holding so long yarn with the boy instead of minding his helm, yawing the vessel about several points. I went on deck and told him to keep the vessel her course and mind his helm. He answered me abruptly and said she was her course, which being an insolent lie, I gave him a shove. He said, go on, for which I gave him a slap across the face instead with my open hand. He being a little fellow, it would have been a pity to strike him. Yep. So this is a pretty typical account of the sort of unofficial level of corporal punishment, interpersonal violence that is pretty common to see in the logs, with a little bit of extra color commentary from the person recording. But this was also a flogging ship. So the next page sees George Anthony, having since been practicing his thieving propensities by taking a bottle of wine from my private locker. When accused, the lie was ready as usual. I told him if he would tell me what he'd done with the wine, I would not flog him. He persisted in denying it, for which I gave him a severe flogging with a small cane, after which he said he wanted to go to the consul. I told him to go to his work immediately and he should see the consul in the morning. It is recorded in the log. Sure, they would have given him leave to go see the consul, but by the next morning he decided not to pursue it. That's how it's recorded. I'm not going to say that's how it happened, but that is how it's recorded. In a way, this log reflects a lot of the kind of stereotypical moments of shipboard life as well, which, as we will see, makes it doubly interesting as a set of papers specifically saved for its attachment to literary history. The crew make a complaint of the bread, which the master notes as having only a few weevils, and that being the sum of their complaints. A few high words having taken place, the person who brought the complaint, one Mr. McCarthy, said he would not eat it and he would not do any more. For his insolence, I collared him, and he was very abusive and said he would fight me for the balance of his run if I would come on the main deck, and used threatening language. They're also not super keen on like storytelling pattern. You know, they're not putting periods in places, not grammatically very sound. So he used very threatening language. Richard Gleason saying the same at the same time that he would knock the mate's bloody head off. McCarthy said he would knock my bloody head off too. And this has a cute little exclamation point. And that's the end of the account. That's the whole story you get. I've also included a shorter one that you might actually be able to read. This is about Thomas Miller, a ship's boy, who is described in the logs as filthy, dirty in his habits. Frequent complaints have been made to me about him, viz. Making water in his bed or wetting the bed, being too lazy to get up, clothes lying about in a filthy state. He has been flogged for it, but he still continues his filthy habit. So yeah, ship's boy would typically be quite young, but with the exception of maybe the wetting the bed and the flogging, it's very typical teenage behavior. I mean, hopefully, don't tell me anything about flogging in the present day. But yes, difficult times. And just because there's Conrad's signature, that's what they saved it for. He doesn't get on until 1878. This is all happening in the 50s. But there it is. So just a week later, in the same log, we might have a feeling of why Miller was avoiding the head. And it's because the head might be cursed. 8 a.m., Thomas Haney, able seaman, after getting his breakfast approximately in good health, relieved the wheel at 9 a.m. Thomas Haney was relieved to go to the head, but did not complain to any person of being unwell. William Miller, second mate, seeing him apparently asleep in the head, went to him and told him not to sit there. Not receiving any answer from him, William Miller took hold of him and found he was dead. Death was caused by an overflow of blood to the heart. When taken from the head, his extremities were quite cold. Must have been dead some minutes before taken from the head. I had him brought aft, applied hot water to his feet on bottles filled with hot water. Again, they just writing stuff, yeah. Covered him with a blanket, but no sign of life appeared. His heart was swelled very large. Shortly thereafter, Thomas Haney is sewed up in a hammock weighted with a bar of iron and consigned to the deep. His effects are sold to the crew at auction, the inventory and profits recorded in another log entry. Those familiar with the rituals of death aboard ship at sea in this era will recognize these actions. Numerous logs and even some agreements have inventories of the effects of deceased seafarers, which our own Dr. Megan Walker has made many very interesting studies of. Of these accounts of death and the dispersal of property, they sometimes seem very cold. But it's worth remembering that while it was a tough old world, where death was not uncommon and practicality dictated a lot of what was going on, the logs were not often spaces for the expression of sentimentality or mourning. But again, that's not often, but not never. One such moment of memorialization can be found in the log of the Eleanor Chapman in 1854. This is the second picture, in which a seafarer had been reported missing. Report that, especially when a ship is in port, most often indicates that they're shortly going to be reported as having deserted. But in this case, His body was found floating nearby later in the week, on the Friday of that week. So found the body of Shoresmith, that's the guy, who was drowned on the night of Sunday by falling overboard from the ship, made a coffin and had him put into it. 8 p.m., a respectable body of seamen headed by their captains joined our ship's company to convey the remains of a brother tar to the cemetery where he was interred under my inspection. So this is unique for a couple of reasons. One, because it's happening close to shore, and two, because there's actually some space given to sort of rituals of mourning, which doesn't often happen in the logbooks, but it does show that it did sometimes happen. So the other thing about these is that despite being official logs, they can be very emotionally rich documents, especially when recalling that anger is an emotion. So one of the funnier things you can find is an absolute treasure trove of insults, some of which I'd gathered here for our review. We have the classic at the top, classic, simple, direct, you are a damned old fuck. There's also an example of a rather harsh performance review, though of course stupid had slightly different connotations back then. It's still not nice, you know. Daniel Moore, second officer in docking ship, was intoxicated, stupid, and incompetent to perform his duty and was sent to his room. I wish I could say that wasn't something you read often about second officers, but you read it. Then again, right, peer review can be slightly worse. Let's see, yep, here we go. We have an argument between engineers. He was a bloody flunky and that he knew his business better than he, the second engineer, knew his. So a little bit of a performance review. They could also be creative, expansive, encompassing. This is a tale where somebody begins using most abusive language to me, calling me a bloody whore, goddamn son of a bitch, a long-legged bugger, and many other more such expressions equally as filthy. I like that one because you get the cadence of it, right? Like you really have to go into it full breath. You could just imagine, and apparently he went on, so. And finally, this is one of my favorites because it was apparently something my grandmother used to call my grandfather on occasion, which is, yes, you damn Dutchman. Was the mate Dutch? Actually, he might have been, but they still shouldn't have had a fist fight in the cabin. That was really the central problem this log was trying to get across. So challenges to authority and moments that verged on or were described as mutiny or mutinous are also a frequent occurrence in the log. Power board, while very rigid, was also under constant negotiation. We have a point raised, which I think I put a slide in for. Yes. We have a point on this matter raised by one Thomas Mooney on the Marco Polo in 1867 on the limitations of the power of the master of the vessel. So several of the men came aft for tobacco. The master told Thomas Mooney that he would not get any until his conduct was different. He had been using the most disgraceful language and mutinous conduct ever since we have left. The master told him that he would be handed over to the British consul at Mobile. He said the master might do as he liked. One thing that he could not do was the master could not fuck him. The passage only being a short one, the master has taken no immediate action in the matter, it being his full intention of laying the whole case before Her Majesty's consul at Mobile to be treated by him according to law. A lot of these log entries, they have to be read over, right, as part of a legal process of confirmation. And so they read this over to him, and the reply was not nothing, which is what it usually is, no comment. And it was also not, I'm sorry, which is another frequent one. It was, it's all correct. That is definitely what he said. So now you know the one thing the master cannot do. So we've had some examples of typical violence and atypical sentimentality. So let's look at some atypical violence and typical sentimentality. Switch it up. On the Dennis Horton in 1866, with some corrections, the story goes like this. So the chief mate, James F. McMullen, called 3 men aft to get up some measure. Some of the words are not quite legible, so I've put in little question marks. Some kind of measure of flour. He took Edward Garrett and William Nowstade down in the hold with him to get out the measure of flour, left John McLeod on deck. They got the flour out of the hatch. The mate told McLeod to pass down the bight of a line to haul up the flour, which McLeod was very dilatory in doing, and gave the mate considerable insolence. And while the mate was standing in the hatch below McLeod, he threw the rope down on the mate's head. The mate then was coming up, and McLeod caught him by the privates and injured the mate considerable. McMullen was close by and broke McLeod's hold. McLeod shipped on board as able seaman, which he is not, cannot, or will not do the duty of an able seaman. I often have to turn him from the wheel and put a man in his place. He is also in the habit of giving insolence, I think, to aggravate the mate. I have often checked him for it. His wages ought to be reduced. The above log has been read to McLeod and no reply made. That is one of the more aggressive actions I've seen taken, but mates had it really rough. They tended to be the ones on which a lot of the violence focused. Pretty frequently, they're getting punched, stabbed, pushed overboard, having all sorts of bad things happen to him. But I will admit, Mr. McLeod shows originality in grabbing the mate's privates. I did not see anybody else do that. So testicular injuries, both through accident and deliberate violence, are pretty normal events. An unfortunate stowaway on the Duke of Sutherland in 1872 died of rupturing himself in that sensitive place. And on the doctor's advice, an AB laid up on the Palestine in 1868 has leeches and linseed meal poultices applied to his. That doctor, however, before this event, had some suspicions cast on his character by a lady passenger. And I promised I would talk about women aboard ship, since that is my area of particular interest, but this one is a bit wild, so hold tight. Palestine was a Cunard vessel and an immigrant ship, and on April 29th, our subject comes into the log, having unfortunately fallen from the sofa in the saloon during a gale and broken the small bone of her knee. I don't know what bone that is. I'm sure maybe somebody knows, but that's the one. Anyway, she's laid up. By May 5th, she's able to get about assisted. By May 13th, she's able to roundly abuse the surgeon, making use of most unwomanly expressions. Mr. Mayhew tells the master the doctor called her a liar and a washerwoman. May 18th, while at dinner, Mrs. Mayhew called down the skylight to her husband, saying, "That disgusting man, Dr. Young, has ordered the mother, named Mrs. Donovan, of a baby that was on board, not to allow me to have it on the poop." The master is like, let's not do that. Let's not be shouting insults about people down the skylight into the saloon. If you have a complaint, let's talk about it face to face. Mr. Mayhew did so, but then told Dr. Young he was an imposter. He should never have charge of an immigrant ship passengers again, and accused him of being always drunk. The master asserts he won't have such disgraceful and unbecoming scenes in the cabin anymore. Mr. Mayhew asserts his wife has been insulted and has been charged by the government to look after the women passengers, something which I have not been able to confirm, but it is out there as a potentiality. The captain was certainly never told that was Mrs. Mayhew's function aboard, which is somewhat suspicious. And at any rate, even if that was the case, it was going to have to get sorted out ashore. And in the meantime, they should all quit it with the unpleasant and disgraceful scenes, which have been more fitted for low society than amongst people calling themselves educated and gentlemen. In the meantime, this was a busy ship. In the meantime, the steward had already been disrated for incompetence, but had been sneaking fresh meat and other cabin stores to the single women. And he gets punched by the clerk, who says, I would do it again if he gave him any cheek. The single women hold a mini revolt, encouraged by a couple of ABs, but the bad weather gets them to go below again. Mrs. Mayhew returns to form as July comes on and flew into a passion with me because I omitted to ask her if she would take any wine for dessert. She said I was in league with the villain of a doctor to insult her. And at this point, the crew promises to mutiny over one of them being disrated, refusing to work at the new rate, and being put in irons for it, which Mrs. Mayhew then kind of joins in on, basically. So she's been encouraging the single women to revolt. She's part of the conspiracy to get them to not go below and not listen to the doctor. So she talks to the ABs about it, leading to July 24th, when I was called on deck to quell a disturbance on getting the main deck. There was Mrs. Mayhew in a most excited state, calling upon the emigrants to lend her a hand to throw the doctor overboard. I and her husband, and this is underlined for emphasis, her husband, got her aft after a deal of trouble. She there behaved like a maniac. All the names she could possibly think of made use of against the doctor. The doctor never speaks to the woman, and I cannot account for this disgusting contact. And what happens next? We should probably look at Trove, the Australian newspaper archive, because at that point, the ship's log doesn't care. Out of their business. There aren't any more entries about her. So a long tale and an interesting one. So there are also remarkable documents for looking at health and medicine. As we mentioned, leeches on testicles is one way to go. In the Advent calendar, I shared this story about a passenger and what was probably a really terrible day at work for the steerage steward of the Canada. So this will concern pregnancy loss, just a heads up. On the 27th of March, 1873, at 9 a.m., John Godbolt, steerage steward, in sweeping the after steerage, found in the waterway of the single women's quarters a placenta. And in parentheses, it clarifies that this is a human placenta. I don't know how you decide such a thing. Maybe it's process of elimination, but the parentheses assure us it was human. After some investigation, a single woman named Mary O'Connor admitted she had been confined the previous night, and as her child was stillborn, she had thrown it overboard. She was at once put in the hospital under the surgeon's care. And that is the whole of her story. I wrote a much more extensive article on pregnancy at sea because it is something that comes up actually quite frequently. And there has been some really good work done on it. You are not usually finding placentas hanging out on the decks, but it was definitely a going concern and something, especially on immigrant ships, that had to be paid attention to. It was a case where working women as well, same issue. Many of these women who are going to work aboard are going to work aboard with some kind of partner, generally assumed to be a husband, although sometimes it's not as clear what the relationship is or if there is one. But in 1872, a husband and wife seemed to have decided not to elaborate on the wife's incapacity, perhaps to hide a pregnancy. The former cook being unable to do the job, H.J. Williams and his wife signed on the Henry Pelham as steward and stewardess while the ship was in the Quebec River on 1st of July. On July 10th, Mrs. Williams briefly went off work, telling the mate she was homesick. The next day, the log recorded that the stewardess told either the master or the mate's wife that she was sick with the monthlies and was afraid she was going to have a miscarriage. July 13th, Mrs. Williams went off duty due to pain in her back and head. The officers recorded their having offered whatever medicines were wanted. The steward and stewardess mentioned she might be in the family way on July 24th, but almost daily updates on the health of the stewardess, when and if she got up, whether she was moving about the galley, how she was feeling, whether she took menu. I mean, this guy, it was annoying. It was annoying. If I had been in any kind of sick state, I would have tried to push the guy overboard and it would have been another mate gone out of the logbooks. But they are trying to do their best, and they keep checking in. So while not unprecedented, the detail and regularity of these logged updates on the stewardess's health possessed an unusual solicitousness. It isn't just about the medicines we're using and the days off work we're recording. This guy is genuinely concerned. One of the last log entries reported that with fine weather at 8 a.m., the stewardess was not up, asked the steward if she was sick. He said she was not very well. I told him that my wife had pains, but felt better to get up and go on deck. No doubt, but his wife would feel better if she got up at 8:30 a.m. and was about the galley all the remainder of the day with her husband. So the advice is go out and get some sunshine, and that apparently helps. The log does not record any incidents of a birth or a miscarriage. So we don't really know whether this was homesickness, the monthlies, some other complaint. We just have a very solicitous mate. So passengers getting up to antics is one thing. Something you'll hear about women's employment at sea was that they had to work under much stricter standards of behavior than the infamously rowdy male seafarers that were their crewmates. However true that might be, it certainly didn't stop some of them. So the ship Oracle had an unfortunate time with its stewardess on a voyage that started May 8th, 1869, ended February 3rd, 1870. Things did not start well. In August, the stewardess went to the galley for some hot water for her tea, and it not being as hot as required, she tossed it in the cook's face. Later that evening, she asked him to heat a pail of water, and he said the fire was almost out, and he wouldn't start another. So close to bedtime. So she threw the pail of water on him. She's got one answer, I guess, to things. The next day, she accused the cook of taking a fork from the cabin. He denied that he took the fork. So she took some object, which is unfortunately illegible, even though it comes up several times. And she accompanied the mystery object with a large butcher knife and drove the cook out of the galley. So after breakfast, she tried to take the fork. He told her to let him alone as it was Sunday and he did not want a noise. So there's your, I guess you can't stab the cook on a Sunday. It's not polite. Naturally, she refused and started to hit him with whatever the other object was. He shoved her and she fell against the wash tub, and then things went completely off the rails. After dinner, she went to her room and remained until tea time, when she came out and while setting the table would cry and scold and wring her hands, saying, "Give me patience." At about 10 p.m., she went to her room and nailed herself in, as in nailed herself into her room. Making a great noise, waking up the officer when the watch was below. That's a very bad thing to do. Monday at 5:30 a.m., the bosun called her and told her it was time to get up. She told him she would not and could not. In the forenoon, the bosun knocked on her door and asked if she would have anything to eat or drink. She would not answer him. At 8 p.m., she began to make a noise. When she was asked what was the matter and requested to open the door, she refused to open. She was asked if she wanted anything. She replied, "Let me alone." She did not want anything to eat or drink. She was again asked to open the door and let some air in, it being very close and warm, but she refused. One of the men, George Roy, was called to see if he could persuade her to open the door. No idea what this relationship is. We just decided that George Roy was the man for the job, and so they send this guy in to go talk to her. So he was called to see if he could persuade her to open the door, but she would not and ordered him away and let her alone, scolding and crying. After the man left the cabin, she made no more noise. Tuesday, the 17th, she was asked by the bosun if she wanted anything to eat. She said no. He told her that she had better open the door and let air in the room, but she refused. At 8 p.m., George Roy and William Hogg, seaman, was called to see if they could get her to open the door, but she still refused. When the captain asked her to open the door, but she would not, he told her if she did not open the door in 2 minutes, it would be opened. After which time, the carpenter was ordered to take the window out so that a man could get in and unfasten the door. The mate went in, again, risking our mates' lives all the time. So the mate went in and opened the door, she hollering murder. There were a number of things taken out of the room, such as a wash tub, boiler, window shutter, boards. And there was found a dish with boiled pork, jug of water, a feeder, carpenter hammer, which he had missed for 8 or 10 days, and some nails. A chamber pot was found which sent forth a rich perfume. It was emptied and washed out during the time she was scolding and raving, ordering them out of the room. Then she fainted, it being very close and warm in the room, and she getting excited, at which water, hawthorn, and camphor was used, and she soon came to. She was repeatedly told no one would hurt her after the room was cleaned out. Disinfecting fluid was sprinkled around the room. A cup of tea was made for her, but she would not drink it. The door was shut and locked as she attempted to go on deck, not properly dressed. A whopping 8 signatures follow this tale, which is a lot. That's a lot. That's a lot of witnesses. They don't try to read it back to her until the 31st. And when they go into her room to try and do so, she won't open the door. The charges in the log against her was then read to her in a loud and distinct manner. And she replied that it wasn't true and that she never got any hot water. And she just gets discharged. End of that contract. It's a weird episode, far from the only event of note on an overall tough trip, and not the only stewardess with a prominent appearance in the log. One of the more overlooked aspects of the crew agreements and logbooks is that they are rich sources of the unexpected for all their supposed formulaic content and formalized purpose. It's often a surprise to folks that I study women working at sea in the way that I do, because according to popular perception, they're not supposed to be there. Or they're not supposed to be there in that way, or in that place, or at that time. These documents are full of things like that. Take, for example, this agreement at the top here from Port of Sydney. Sorry. It's a printed form. The form is from the Port of Sydney, so it is not one of the forms produced by the British, specifically produced for that port. Separate agreements existed for colonial crew, but depending on what the ship had on hand or what they decided to turn in, you'll get all kinds of documents and all kinds of crew recorded on them. This one is fairly typical. You can see the selection that I've come through here is that these are anglicized Chinese names. A lot of them follow the typical format of anglicized Chinese names, and they put the ah syllable in front. This is just something that they commonly did, but one might expect that to happen. One might expect if a name was going to be written down, it'd be written down by the officer in the English way. However, that's not always the way that these crew interacted with these documents. It wasn't always mediated through officials. You can see the release on the far side here from the Thetis. This is a specific document for crew signing off at the end of a voyage. They had to put their signatures on it, and these individuals put their names as they write them, right? It is in characters. It has not been anglicized because presumably they signed themselves. So that's 1853. We have also this steward signing on in Madras. Unfortunately, I mean, if anybody can read what that says, I thought it might be Pondicherry at one point, but I think there's a T in it. I'm not sure, but that seems likely. At any rate, this is both where the name is filled in and on the opposite end where the signature is on this particular form. It is written in a non-Roman fashion. So yes, this is not to imply you don't also have moments that are less than stellar. From the Sullock Castle in 1853, we have this, where a person is signed as an Indian from India. And that's it. There's no signature. That's all the information we get other than what's written in the document there. So these are a few examples of the way these records both capture and don't capture race. Compared to American records, British records are far more circumspect about race, but that doesn't mean it was any less important an issue at the time. We have this particular story from the Trent that is in 1853. Goes like this. All the black firemen and coal trimmers headed by Francis Frett came aft and in the most mutinous manner demanded why George Henry was put in irons, such a thing having not taken place. They were also ordered to their work, when they all refused and demanded to be put in irons also. They were ordered to the quarterdeck when the ringleader, Francis Frett, used abominable, blasphemous, and threatening language, he also being one who had let the fire's steam go down, although the ship was then 3/4 of a mile off a dangerous reef. This behavior had reached such a fearful extent that the captain consulted the officers, and it was decided that unless such conduct was at once put down, the ship would not be safe with so many black men on board. And the man, Francis Frett, was therefore seized up to the main rigging and received a dozen lashes with a cat, which had the desired effect. More than a few things of note in this story, many of which can hardly be well discussed without giving it its own talk or its own paper or its own book. But first, right, race is obviously a going concern for the officers on this ship, even though it is not something being formally recorded in the way it would be on an American record. Flogging in the merchant fleet operated differently than in the Navy, but it's hard to say how differently. Certainly not so differently than it was any more unusual, but reactions could be more varied. At this point, at any rate, flogging is very much going out of fashion, although obviously it hadn't stopped. And even if it had, flogging as a punishment for racialized seafarers would potentially be viewed as more appropriate by the white officers than flogging of white seafarers. This is something Isaac Land has talked about in particular. And again, the fact is that this is specifically the black seafarers acting in solidarity, or at least in cooperation. That is specifically what is so threatening to the officers. Actions in protest or solidarity were not infrequent from seafarers, though the scale and nature of participant has lots of different meanings onto when, how, who it happened in the name of, the reasons it happened for, all those kinds of things very intensely. For what it's worth, Francis Frett continues to regularly absent himself without leave with several others, so he at least does not seem to have been cowed as an individual, even if this group action was stymied by the flogging. So we've taken quite a trip, and quite a light and fast one, actually. Though only a few of the stories I've run across, this is just a small sample. It's not even all the ones that are in the 25-day Advent calendar I did through social media posts, from which a lot of these stories were highlighted. So I've run across them mostly while looking for other things in the crew agreements and logbook collections, most of which live, oh my God, this is where I'm supposed to have my directional sense, right here. Yes, thank you so much. Right over here in the Mass building in the basement at the Maritime History Archive. And to be honest, I've given you extremely little to go on for most of these stories. I didn't even cover all the stories. I didn't even tell you all the context, but you got some nice bite-sized chunks. I did showcase some of the things you can find in this archive. I mean, we didn't even get the guy who started stripping naked and threatened to thrash everybody on the quarterdeck and then was yelling. So his friend who was down below, sick, off work with the rheumatics, came up and said he was going to thrash everybody too. They just waited him out, I think, that time. But that's a good story. Hopefully, also, I've left you with a lot of questions because there's really not much context that I've given you here. Some of that context is findable, some of it isn't. Some questions can be answered, some I don't have answers to, though they are out there. Some can't be answered at all. I'm going to do my best during the Q&A, so feel free, launch them, we'll deal with them. But what is the purpose of sharing all these stories then, other than that I think they're fun and interesting? I opened this talk by giving a little bit of the story of how these documents ended up in Newfoundland, and I said, since there's been plenty of talk back and forth about what the documents are for and how best to use them and what their place is, but there's one thing I think that is absolutely vital that we cannot afford to forget about that story. The particular instances that made up the particular instance papers are the stuff of life. They're the story of the day-to-day, and they can be wild and tragic and stupid and fascinating and vulgar and difficult to deal with in their vastness and their unthreaded nature and their unexplained variety, but it is very critically the everyday stories of everyday people. We can make it into all sorts of bigger stories. We talked about race and emotions. We can talk about empire and labor and work and solidarity, mortality, mental health, material culture, medicine, all sorts of things I didn't even have time to put examples of in here. What happened, what Memorial saved, was the history of us. And now it is up to us to keep it, to maintain it, to continue to see the value in it and to defend it. It can't be kept and it won't be kept without our effort, our attention, our investment, and our institutions. An archive of this magnitude, of this importance, can't exist without institutional support, without dedicated, trained individuals to help take care of it, and without a community invested in it. And the moment we stop, the moment we look away or think it's going to get along without us, it'll be tossed in the fire and gone forever, which is exactly what Britain planned to do with it. So if that happens, it'll be cool. We'll have Joseph Conrad's signature in London, neat. But I just wanted to show you, look at all of the stuff that we lose. That, I think, is the most important part of the story. So yes, thank you.
Hey, what's down here? Question.
Online, are these documents indexed in any way? Are names or destinations indexed?
They are indexed in a variety of ways. The MHA has done a really excellent job. They not only have an entire year of documents online, the 1881 that you can look for. They have Newfoundland documents online, but they also have a searchable index by ship number. Now, this is the trick with the documents. You got to have some kind of information on who or what you're looking for, and the what is better than the who. In facilitating this, you have the Crew List Index project called CLIP. It's crewlists, I think, .org.uk, something like that. But they have many more search parameters that can help you narrow things down and links to documents. So you can absolutely start getting into them. There's nothing quite like pulling out that document and finding out you're touching someone that somebody died of smallpox with, and seeing the documents in person. But you can get started online really easily.
Given your concluding remark, that archive at risk of disposal or serious mismanagement or something else?
I will admit, yeah, of course, we've revealed the big secret that I am from Texas. So naturally, I've been thinking about the robustness of institutions. And the truth of the matter is that there doesn't have to be a specific threat. There just has to be inattention. We just need to think that, oh, it's going to be okay another year with a cut budget, or oh, it's going to be okay another year without hiring a new person. That's what ends up happening, is that slowly these things degrade over time. So there's not a specific threat that I want to call out. If there was a specific action or like a group that we could all join to get into to help support things, I would have listed it in there, but really it's about reminding ourselves of what we have and making sure that we don't lose sight of it. That was really the goal, rather than facing a specific threat.
Two questions. How much, or how many of the records are actually Newfoundland based?
70%? It's around 70, right? Okay, Dave is here, so I'm looking at him. But it's around 70. And the thing is that we have the valuable bit. What they did, and this is all part of the story of how this archive got taken apart, but what they did is they were trying everything in order to save it before Memorial came in, but that meant, one, a lot of regional archives just took their bits, or they took random samples, they took little bits. And these are great, there's documents scattered all around. The National Archives themselves took a 10% random sample, which is truly random in the sense that they did not invest in having employees actually do it in a scientifically backed way. So it is quite random what's in there. And then they have the 10% sample that is the celebrated ships, sort of. You can kind of call it 10%. It's really just whatever they had. And then the National Maritime Museum took every 5 years, and also 1861 and 1862. So what they have is a bunch of random stuff, and also all of Joseph Conrad's boats. And what we have is everything else. It's all the good stuff. So you can do things like, I've tracked people's careers, which is difficult and not always possible, but I've tracked people's careers. You can look at whole ship careers. We have 90% of all of that stuff. And by 90, I mean 70, but it's the important stuff. So I said 90.
Second question, what is the actual volume of this memorial has? How many boxes we got?
Oh. Say it again. It was between 4 and 6 shipping containers. The original shelf mileage was something, like 40 miles? It's an absolute mother load. It's incredible.
The boxes would go back and forth to Signal Hill a lot. Remember the actual.
Do you have the actual? 50,000 boxes.
If not,
I've done my best to touch everyone.
Went through the boxes, yeah, index them. Or longer, yeah.
So just for the people online, I'll say it closer to the mic. They did an initial indexing, which took, at the low end, 2 years to complete.
I think that once the archive got established, there were the history department, many of them made contributions, like David Alexander, Panting, Rosemary Ulmer, Skip Fisher, all those guys. Like there was a a foundational, was it 6 or 7 volumes?
Yeah, that was all part of the Atlantic Canada shipping project.
Yeah, so, and they kind of laid a foundation and say, look, this stuff is here, this is what we can do with it, go to it.
Mhm.
And so what's happened since then?
Oh man, I would say a lot of stuff has happened since then. So the Atlantic Canada Shipping Project not only produced the database on which my project is based. This is how I found a lot of the people that I found. Otherwise, it would have been quite a mission to do what I've done. But they not only created the database, but they had several books come out on that. A lot of those are economic history focused, of course. Since that, in particular, Valerie Burton picked up on things like the website. She put up the More Than a List of Crew, which I put up there, that explains and introduces the documents, talks a little bit about them, introduced a bunch of students to them. In terms of other big projects, I think those are our big ones. It's been a lot of individual scholarship, individual interest. I mean, the Crew List Index project, when I say that this is incredibly useful, it's an all-volunteer enthusiast project.
Is it mostly like blue water shipping, like deep sea shipping? Or what about the coastal trade? Is that in there too? The local?
Absolutely. That's what the little green agreements are for. Those are scattered through as well. It's kind of a grab bag. It is a lot of deep water shipping. It's a lot of passenger vessels. Many companies kept their own records, so you might have company ships that are kept elsewhere.
There's a wonderful long narrative poem that was written. What was the guy's name? I can't remember now. Anyway, he was talking about the various ships that he owned. It seemed like he'd build a schooner one year and he'd be lucky to get 2 years out of it before it sank. And the Earls were known as Spars Earl because they sank so many ships. All the spars were sticking up along the shore and all the insurance claims were gone mad. So, I mean, it seemed like, there's a lot of ships to deal with.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
When you talk about the local trade,
Proud.
Ah.
Captain Proud, a wonderful book-length narrative poem. Actually, somebody, I think it was Rex Murphy, said it's the finest bit of poetry that he read on this.
Nice.
when you're dealing with the local ships, is there any correlation between those that were lost and the documents that you have? Ones that are known to have been lost?
Ooh, that's a complicated one because I am typically focused on other things. So I'm not sure I have a good answer for that one. Yeah, sorry.
In the future.
It would be a great project. There are 8 million great projects in every little nook and cranny of these stories, and that's not even all the stories. So,
Have any volunteers here?
yeah, exactly.
Jobs other than stewardesses. Second one is over convict ships in a set of documents.
So female crew other than cooks and stewardesses, that one is difficult, and it's because you have something funny that goes on with the names. So in a certain sense, like we saw, sometimes you get direct input, like we are pretty sure that those Chinese seafarers wrote their own names because it'd be really astounding if the British guy did it. But sometimes you have mostly indirect input. And because women were not always considered important parts of the crew, frequently their information would be filled out by other people. And when you get this happening, you get things like abbreviations. It'll be like SW, it'll be Mrs. Froud, it'll be, it'll be Mrs. whoever. And then you have the complication of the way names are used changing because there is no gender marker. So the only real way you can determine the sex of somebody, other than sort of the normal assumption that you make based on binaries and habits and all this kind of stuff, is to look into the name. And not only have names changed, but sometimes, for example, I had a ordinary seafarer, and this is an example that I didn't put in this one, but an ordinary seafarer, and in one case, the name is recorded as Sarah, S-E-R-A, and then in another case, it is S-A-R-A-H. But it's a double whammy because the seafarer is also from another place. They are a quote unquote foreign seafarer, so not British, which means there was probably not as much care taken to make sure the name was either accurately recorded, or it could be a foreign name that this person has transliterated in this way. So the short answer is, of course, probably something like no. But the long answer is that it's a very complicated process to find women in the first place. The reason I focus on stewardesses is because it's one of the surefire ways I can identify that this is probably a female person. And the other question I have forgotten because I went on for too long.
Were there any convict ships in the set about?
Oh, not in the ones that I found, but most of the convict ships, well, they could be convict ships. The way that they transported convicts was not always, there was a lot of just, we need some more women in Australia, so we're just going to convict these women of some capital crimes and put them on a ship, and we'll say it's helping immigration. So sometimes you would get things like that, but most of the transportation would be happening, or the big transportation missions would be happening before 1850, so they're recorded in a different set of documents. You can, however, find those documents. Those exist. They're out there. Anyone?
Question was, were there any slave ships, basically?
Not on mine, but again, it's because of what I was looking into. And the other tricky thing is, right, they're not recording race, they're not recording cargoes. So these documents don't often directly speak to what's being carried in the ship. And the other thing is, especially for earlier documents, when Britain is still allowing enslaved people, especially in the Caribbean and stuff, it's very difficult to tell when you run across an enslaved person unless something very kind of stereotypical is happening and you start to make assumptions. You know, somebody who's recorded as a servant who has a very typical, like, this is a name somebody was given because they were enslaved. So in my document set, no. Doesn't mean they're not out there. Doesn't mean there's not evidence of the lives of enslaved people in some of these things. We just have to find a way to look for it.
How much, if any, of this has been microfilm, please?
Oh my God, I don't think very much at all. The crew agreements microfilmed?
No, that's a collection that we're talking about the name. 1951, 1956. They're not microfilmed and they're not digitized except for the year 2001.
Mm-hmm. And most of that, the Maritime History Archive has taken the initiative to undertake on their own. So the stuff that has been preserved in alternate formats is mostly because we've gone through the effort to preserve it. You can tend to find little pockets of them. And in fact, there is an entire mystery that is one of the ones that I want to investigate regarding the colonial agreements that I mentioned. So I mentioned we have that Port of Sydney document, and it's just in there. It's just one of the things that happens to be in that bundle of documents. You'll get incidental stuff like that all the time. But also we have these big pockets of documents that would have been collected by local shipping offices that are presumably still there somewhere. We just haven't found them, or they're not cataloged as such, or they're in some kind of back room of some merchant shipping office. So they definitely exist other places. You'll find incidental pockets of documents. We, in fact, have a set of documents for Newfoundland that should have been in Britain that just stayed in Newfoundland. We never sent them back for a certain period of time. So absolutely, there are pockets of other documents, particularly in Australia, I think. I think Australia, because they have a really big digitization project, they have some really interesting documents that might actually be accessible.
How much longer is your postdoc? And how do we continue to learn and find out about all these big discoveries and improvements?
Thank you. Oh, what an excellent question. My postdoc is going to go through till August. So the end is nigh. You should see a furious amount of things getting published in whatever outlet will take them. And of course, I'm trying to do regular academic publishing, which is not always as accessible. But I've also done things like talk to the broadcasts. We've done Gazette articles. We do blog posts. I try to do, I do volunteer for teaching positions in the history department, and those poor students are going to learn about crew agreements whether they want to or not. It'll be in there somewhere. So hopefully you should be able to just put a little alert on my name or on the Maritime History Archives, and we'll have more stuff for you soon.
Commercial working class, military workers?
Not that I've seen. This is all merchant shipping, which is what makes it so incredibly unique. A lot of generalization happens because naval records are kind of the epitome of maritime records. They are very well kept, very consistent, all of this sort of stuff. These merchant records, as we've seen, are just incredibly rich, and they tend to be sort of pushed to the side by maritime historians in favor of the sort of more searchable, more backupable naval records. So as far as I know, no naval records in here, but also it's all the other cool stuff.
I'm sorry, I've never read any of your work. It's not my field.
That's okay.
I'm curious about what your method is when you're confronted with like vast quantity of analog material. You have a hell of a lot of reading to do. Can you give us an example of how you would go about a particular investigation, how you would process all of this, how you would find your thematic content? Can you just give us a little snapshot of what your method would be?
Oh, absolutely. And this is why the history of the archive and the work that has been done of it is so very important. Without the database done by the ACSP, I wouldn't have even known there were this many women to find. And finding women was the premise of my first project, which actually I got from Skip Fisher. He brought me in when I was an MA student and said, I happen to have this stuff. Is this stuff interesting? And I was hooked. So what I do is I'll start with something like that. Start with something that I can find a lot of broad information on. What the database allows me to do is trace people's careers because they'll show up in big pockets of records. And then I can follow on the crew agreements. They have a field called previous ship. And as long as they've stayed on a British vessel, there will usually be some kind of identifying information that I can then put into CLIP or some other resource to start tracing these records back. So it's a lot of different people's work coming together in different ways. I did do one brute force effort where it was 1873. There were, was it 763 boxes? And I did a sample. I was like, okay, we got to try. I can't be fully dependent. I got to see what I can do with just going in. And that was incredibly difficult. 760 something boxes. And I did a sample of the first 50, the middle 50, and the last 50. And I just read them all. And it was a lot. I found a lot of cool stuff. That is where I found a lot of this stuff, because you're reading along and then all of a sudden it says, somebody flung themselves off of the back of the ship, but luckily we caught them. You know, you pay attention. So yeah, it is possible. It is possible. And I've done most of those methods. And they all turn up a kind of different useful thing. Yeah, hopefully that's something. Oh, I am looking into potentially doing that, but I haven't done it as like a beginner project. One of the things that's cool is that because the Atlantic Canada Shipping Project was doing what they're doing, they were doing a wide-scale economic analysis of the shipping industry of Atlantic Canada. And one of the things they decided to do was when they made the cruise database, which is the one that has all the people in it, they entered every crew agreement for that ship. So if they found one and they were like, we're going to start entering the crew, they made sure that they always entered all of the agreements for that ship. So doing that project is actually probably one of the more doable things. It's one of the things you could probably get into quite well. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Are we trying to use AI and transcription tools to expedite pulling data from these files?
So there are a couple of issues with that. The first one is probably the nature of the documents, which I think you saw. Not only is there a lot of printed information, but the handwriting is incredibly variable. The way the information is filled out is incredibly variable. And those people just made marks all over the place. So, right, even the Joseph Conrad signature, which you think they'd want to do like preserve under a glass case, somebody took a big blue crayon and put a thing next to it so they would know it was Joseph Conrad's signature, right? There's a lot of extraneous marks. So it makes it very difficult. The structure of the documents make them very difficult to scan, which is one reason why the 1881 project is both so impressive and because it's 1881, is because by then the documents are slightly more regular in the way that they are shaped. I didn't show very many, but some of these documents are enormous. The earlier ones, very varied. And the third thing is that we're only just now getting a good it is AI driven, large language model driven OCR method of reading handwriting. It's working out. It's called Transcribus. It's apparently working out pretty well. It's mostly working out pretty well for scribe written documents. So these are documents that have incredibly well practiced regular handwriting, which is not what we have. So if that project is going to happen, it's probably further down the line. And that is an excellent question. It is actually something that David Alexander tackled in one of the, I think they named the whole volume after, and that one's the Working Men Who Got Wet volume. So there's a whole article about it. Unfortunately, he did not get to finish that research. However, we do have sort of an initial look, and at least from what he noticed and the analysis at the time was that we have a surprisingly literate group. They are not a significantly different, there's not evidence of a significantly different educational level than other people in similar economic cohorts, right? They don't differ from their peers. There's not, you know, oh, no sailors can read and every bricklayer can read. They appear to be pretty on par. But the documents are very conflicting for that. You can kind of tell if the same hand has filled everything out. That's pretty easy to tell. It's not always a one-to-one. Is this signature this person's signature? Is it the consul's signature for him? There are a lot of questions, but with a data set as large as the Atlantic Canada Shipping Project was working with, that was the conclusion Alexander was able to come to. So we've actually got a fairly literate, or at least on par literacy level for the seafarers in the group.
I seem to remember his research, particularly with seamen, was whether or not they could sign their name or whether they signed with the neck. So it was a very, basic method that he used, and he compared different countries and, what Newfoundland situation was and what the UK and
Mhm.
the Nordic countries and all that. And there was really quite striking differences.
Yeah, and signatures are, they're a middle indicator. So the idea is literacy is not one skill. You have writing and you have reading. And so if you can sign your name, probably more people could sign their name than could read, but yeah, less people could sign their name than could read. It's in the middle. So basically, it's a pretty interesting question to ask. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm sorry about the sound. I didn't have a microphone here myself. And unfortunately, and for those online, I don't know if they heard all the questions, but I hope we might have answered some of the questions.
Oh, I should have repeated. I always forget to do that. I'm sorry.
Anyway, Dr. Stryker, thank you very much for your very entertaining, but also very enlightening talk, because I don't think many people in this room are aware of the extent of the Maritime History Archive and that the work has been done.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it says that there's a future in it for anyone who's interested. Not many young people here, but for those who are doing graduate work in history, honors work, it's a great opportunity. It's a resource that is open. I wouldn't say easily found, but it hadn't been indexed.
Mhm.
So thank you very, very much. And